Good evening, everyone. Welcome to New York University's Institute lecture for this evening. For those of you visiting for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are visiting us again, welcome back. I'm Dave Shikatano. I'm the Dean of Science here at NYU Abu Dhabi and a professor of biology at NYU in New York. And it gives me very great pleasure to introduce one of NYU's own faculty this evening, Professor Elizabeth Phelps. Liz earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from Ohio Wesleyan University and subsequent to that earned her master's degree and doctorate from Princeton University, both in psychology. She specializes in cognition and cognitive neuroscience. She joined the faculty at Yale University after earning her degrees and then, fortunate to NYU, joined us in 1999, rising through the ranks to full professor. In recognition of her extraordinary scholarship, NYU wisely awarded her a Julius Silver Chaired Professorship in 2008. Liz's extraordinary scholarship has resulted in well over 100 papers and book chapters that have been cited a staggering 10,000 times by her colleagues in her field. Her work in fMRI and imaging is internationally recognized. And just as important to any dean and any student, Liz teaches psychology in New York to the undergraduates. Most important, she actually teaches Introduction to Psychology, which is a turn-on for all the kids who take it. Liz, I'm very pleased that you came over to Abu Dhabi to join us this evening. The title of her talk, make sure I get it right, Heart or Head, How Brain Science Alters Our Understanding of Emotions and Decisions. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Phelps.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I enjoyed my brief tour of your beautiful city today, and I look forward to seeing more tomorrow. I'm going to talk today about my research on emotion decision-making, and my research on emotion spans emotion and learning, emotion and cognition, and most recently emotion and decision-making. And my interest in this comes from the idea that, we think emotion is something that tells you what matters to you in the world, so of course it should influence your decisions. In spite of this, there's been surprisingly little research that has experimentally manipulated emotion or measured it. So I'm going to start by giving you sort of the historical perspective for how we think about the relationship between emotion and decision-making. And then I'm going to tell you why I think that's not the right way to think about it. So this title is really Heart or Head ? So as many of you know, when you make a decision, you often talk about making a decision with your heart or your head, right? This idea that we have two ways to make a decision. We can either reason something through, or we can kind of go with our gut, our instinct. And this idea has been around since the time of Plato. Immanuel Kant also talked about this. And any of you who know Freud, also, he was talking about how we have this competition between sort of our emotional desires, and our morality and our consciousness. And so this is a very old idea. It's also spread to economic theory. So this is Danny Kahneman, who's really was a psychologist to start, but is mostly known as an economist. He was actually won the Nobel Prize in economics for introducing sort of some of the behavioral study of psychology to economics and showed some of the ways that we go wrong in our decision-making when we think we're making a completely rational choice. And he published a book recently in introducing the idea that he proposed a long time ago, saying that we really have two systems for making choices. System one, and emotions considered part of system one. And this operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. And again, there's many things that they're aside from emotion. And system two allocates attention to the effortful mental activities that demand it, including complex computations. The operations of system two are often associated with subjective experience of agency, choice, and concentration. This idea that we decide with our heart and our head has also reached into psychological and neuroscience theories of emotion decision-making. So here is just one such distinction. It's been talked about emotions as being made with a hot system or a cool system. And here's some work by a gentleman named Figner who works at Columbia, saying that risk-taking, this is are you risky or not, is the result of a competition between two neural systems. So that affective processing is spontaneous and automatic. operates by principles of similarity, contiguity, and influences behavior by affective impulses. In contrast, the cognitive control system is the neural basis of deliberative processing, which is effortful, controlled, and operates according to formal rules of logic, and is the neural basis of inhibitory control, a mechanism that can block affective impulses and therefore enables deliberative decision-making even in affectively charged situations. So this idea is probably most commonly thought about in the notion of intertemporal choice. So what is intertemporal choice? We have to make decisions sometimes where we have to weigh an immediate benefit versus the long-term benefit. So I don't know if you've ever had this problem. I've had this problem, where you see something like a donut, but I'd really love to lose a few pounds. Do I eat the donut now? Do I not? Do I wait? Do I lose a few pounds? This is the classic problem of intertemporal choice. Which thing is more rewarding to me? Clearly, in the long term, the donut's not very rewarding to me. It's only rewarding to me right now. Losing weight has a lot of health benefits, et cetera. And in spite of the fact that all of us know how to lose weight. Anybody in the room not know how to lose weight? I'll tell you. Ready? All of us know how to lose weight. It's still incredibly hard for us to do it. And this is because we have this tendency to discount future rewards relative to immediate rewards. And in decision-making tasks in laboratories, we do something like this. Given a choice, would you take $10 now, or would you take $20 30 days from now? And there have been many, many studies looking at this. It's also linked to things like retirement savings. And what we do in the laboratory is we know that people discount the value of the delayed reward, and this is how we calculate it. So the value of the immediate reward is $10, right? The value of the delayed reward, so here's a subjective value. Subjective value means the value to you, right? And this you show me by your choice, right? It's your subjective value of that thing. Is related to both the amount of reward, the actual delay that you have to wait, and also individuals discount things in the future more or less. So we call that K. So this is the individual discount rate parameter. So just to give you an example of this, here's somebody with a high K, here's somebody with a low K. This is very small text, I apologize, but here's the value lost of something in the future, okay? So relative to $10 now, what's $20 in the future? How many days does it take $20 to become worth what $10 is now to you? And for this person with a high discount rate, it takes about 20 days to have it lose 50% of its value, $20 lose 50% of its value. This person with a low discount rate takes about 100 days to lose 50% of your value. So individuals vary a lot in how impulsive they are. It's been suggested, and this is most famously associated with David Leibson, who's a professor of economics at Harvard, that temporal discounting is a failure of self-control over affective impulses, right? So it's really competing your self-control with your emotion. Your self-control, your cognition tells you to wait, your emotion tells you to go for that. And as I mentioned, this leads to things like poor retirement savings, obesity, and addiction. Brain science also suggested, right, that we have this affective division of the brain. This is a slide by Paul MacLean in 1949. This is the limbic system. The limbic system, it lines the inner border of the cortex. It's been proposed to be the emotional system of the brain. As you can see, back then, they didn't have all the beautiful graphics that we have today. I would love to sort of draw a figure for a paper, but I can't. But he could. And this was from a paper of his in 1949. It's centered on the hippocampus, and the word hippocampus comes from the word for seahorse, which is why that looks like that. And it's been argued that things like temporal discounting, and this is based on some brain imaging research, that is due to the weighing of regions we call emotion and region we call cognition. So this is something taken from Jonathan Cohen's work. He wrote an article for Economist, and he argued that the human brain is vulcanized. So if you guys remember Spock from Star Trek, Spock, was a better something than the rest of us because he didn't have emotion to cloud his judgments and his decisions. And that really what you get is these sort of prefrontal control regions, these cognitive regions that weigh against emotional regions, and we make better decisions. So what I've suggested to you so far is that this notion of dual systems in the brain has a long history in psychology, has been adopted by economic theories, and more recently incorporated into psychological and neural theories of decision making. And of course, it's very intuitive to say to yourself, listen to your heart, don't make that foolish choice with your heart, really think it through, make it with your head. So I'm going to spend the rest of the talk arguing that that's not right, right? That it really, when we get to think about the science of emotion decision making, it doesn't quite fit. In spite of all of this, this work, it doesn't quite fit the data. And what was so surprising to me when I actually got into looking at emotion decision making, because my background was studying emotion and cognition more broadly, was how few people have actually experimentally investigated this relationship. It seems as if the philosophers who were so powerful in so much of Western thought, and their ideas were taken up by theorists about behavior like Freud, by economists and by psychologists, without ever investigating the basic principles. And so the question I'm going to ask is, does the scientific evidence support these notions? So first, what are the problems with this dual system approach? More recently, so that chart I showed you of the limbic system was done from 1949. It was a very important theory at its time. MacLean was a great neuroanatomist, and we can credit him with many things. But over time, the limbic system concept has not held up. So for instance, I mentioned, he sort of centered the limbic system here on the hippocampus. We no longer think of the hippocampus as a region that's very important in emotion. The hippocampus is the region that if you have damage to this region, you're amnesic. It's one of the first regions that shows damage in Alzheimer's disease. That's why one of the first symptoms is a memory problem, right? So the hippocampus is critical in memory, doesn't have a very big role in emotion that we know of. And you have other regions of the brain that don't quite fit this conceptualization. There's no inclusion or exclusion criteria. So people have started to say, well, maybe there is a limbic system, but he got it wrong. So it doesn't include the hippocampus. Maybe it also includes regions of the prefrontal cortex that were not part of his limbic system, MacLean's limbic system. But if you look at what the criteria is to be part of the limbic system, there's really no criteria. There's no evidence that there's a system, like a single system that drives emotion. And for all of these reasons, affective scientists, neuroscientists now suggest the limbic system concept should be abandoned. And I've cited here Joe Ledoux, who's my colleague at NYU, who's one of the most well-known affective neuroscientists studying rodents today. But you'll find similar things written by neuroanatomists and cognitive neuroscientists. So there's not an emotion system in the brain. It's not held up over time. And in these theories, emotion is always equated with irrational choices. But as I already mentioned, studies of decision making have largely failed to measure or manipulate, and here I mean scientifically investigate the role for emotion. So I want to give you one example. This is a study we did looking at this problem, intertemporal choice. We brought people into the laboratory, and when I say people, I mean undergraduates. And we offered them choices like this, a whole series of choices like this. And we measured an emotional response. And let me just go through what I mean by emotion. So we use the word emotion to mean many things. You use it to mean mood, we use it to mean stress. In the laboratory and in theories of emotion, emotion is also often used to describe the discrete response you have to an internal or external event. So it can be somewhat transient, but you see something, it kind of has an emotional charge. That we call an emotion. It encompasses a range of responses. So the one that you're consciously aware of is subjective feelings. I feel this way. But also your bodily response. You may get aroused or not. Physiological arousal is part of an emotional response. You can have a facial expression that tells me what your emotion is. And it also engenders you to move away from something or towards something. So if you find something a little threatening, you may have a little arousal response, you may decide to walk the other way. I'm going to measure in these studies I talk about today, I'm going to measure the physiological response. This is the autonomic nervous system response. It's the fight or flight response. You usually think about it in the situation of threat, but even relatively small emotional things create a small change in your autonomic nervous system. It's just very transient. That's really just a small signal to you that there's something relevant in the environment, and we can measure that transient response. And we measure it by measuring the output systems of the autonomic nervous system. And two of them that we measure are pupil dilation. So your pupils dilate in two circumstances: when the light changes and when you're aroused. And so some people who claim they can tell lying do this by measuring. They think your pupils are getting bigger or smaller. Are you feeling aroused by that? And the other is the skin conductance response. We put little electrodes on your fingers, and when you have just slight sweating, you actually aren't sweating, but you have this autonomic nervous system response. If it was very intense, you would sweat. But even before that, your skin changes, your sweat glands change, so you get a little change in the electrical conductivity of your skin. So those are the two things we measure in the laboratory. They're indications of arousal. So we measured higher arousal. We measured arousal while people did this task. And our hypothesis, based on the work of David Laibson, the economist David Laibson, and others, is that higher arousal, greater pupil dilation, to the immediate reward predicts a steeper discount rate. So the theory is, and we believe this theory too, just so you know, before we did this experiment. The theory is you get so excited about this thing in front of you that it's hard for you to make the other choice, to wait, right? And it's that excitement that causes you to choose it. And so we did a study like this. People saw a number of choices like this. So the immediate rewards were either $10, $20, or $30. The delayed rewards came a week later, 30 days later, 60 days later, or 100 days later, or 180 days later, and varied in amounts that were scaled to the immediate reward. And what we found is that pupil dilation, here's the discount rate that I talked about, doesn't correlate. So when you're more aroused, the immediate reward, that doesn't predict your choice. What predicts your choice is how aroused you are by the delayed reward. How much do you get excited about the thing in the future, right? So maybe, this led us to the hypothesis that maybe the reason we discount things is not because we get so excited about the immediate things, but because we have a harder time getting excited about the things in the future. There's been studies now that have shown that if you can get people to think more concretely about the things in the future, that increases the emotional intensity of those things, and individuals are more likely to pick them. And we find this effect, but I should say that we find really what you're doing is in different situations, you may weigh the immediate reward more. In other situations, you may weigh the delayed reward more. It kind of depends. And so you're really weighing, in some ways, the relative value of the different rewards. In situations where the immediate rewards are more stable, the delayed reward matters more. When the delayed reward is more stable, the immediate reward matters more. The point is, it's complicated. It doesn't fit a simple story of impulse and control. So our initial investigations, at least in this one behavior that's been cited a lot as tapping into this conflict between emotion and reason, suggests emotions may not always drive irrational choices. Sometimes emotions may drive rational choices. I think we use the word reason sort of loosely here. So what's rational or irrational varies. But the value of something is linked to its emotional response in some circumstances, and you can change that and change your emotional response. So when we think about now what's the relation between emotion and cognition in the brain more broadly, we know quite a bit more about how emotion influences perception or memory. And in all these circumstances, what's been shown is that emotion has a modulatory function on other cognitive functions. So it's a modulatory influence. Let me give you a few examples. So in perception, this is a monkey brain. That's why it looked kind of squished. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. This is the visual cortex. This is a region that's very important in processing early visual stimuli, and then the farther up you go this way, the more likely you are to sort of get more complex object representations. This is a sort of cartoon version of an anatomical study on the monkey brain showing that this region here, the amygdala, has reciprocal connections with the entire visual pathway here, including very early visual areas. And there's been a lot of research showing that if you see something that's emotional or a little threatening, you actually show better perception. You need less contrast to be able to detect what it is. And that's a type of function that is related to this part of the visual cortex. And if you damage the amygdala, you fail to show that enhancement with perception, with emotion. So what we think is going on in this case is that the amygdala is a region that tells you there's something here that matters, it's threatening, it's sort of a relevance detector. The amygdala is getting information about what's in the environment very quickly and then sending back a signal saying this thing matters, perceive it better, or attend to it a little bit more strongly. In memory, we see the same thing. So here again, I'm focusing on the amygdala, and I will focus on the amygdala at this talk. I'll tell you right now, the amygdala is not the whole story when it comes to emotion, but I'm going to be talking about it today. So here's the amygdala, and next to the amygdala is the hippocampus, that region I told you about that's very important in memory. When something happens that's very arousing, the amygdala modulates the storage of that memory by the hippocampus. And it's been argued by Jim McGall, who studied this system in detail, that actually the reason memories take a long time to store is that you can find out the emotional significance of those things after the fact, and you have an opportunity now for emotion to influence how strong that memory is. And we know that this depends on the amygdala. Not the memory being stored itself, but its extra boost when something's highly arousing. So we wanted to ask this question, does this extend this modulatory role for the amygdala in cognition broadly? In the situation where you find something emotionally relevant, does it extend to decision making? And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So here's the amygdala, just to navigate you in the brain a little bit. The amygdala is sort of in the middle of your brain. It's pretty small. It's about the size of your thumb tip. It gets its name for the word for almond, which you can kind of see here. And the pictures I'll show you will look something like this. It's sort of this gray area inside these circles. As I mentioned already, the amygdala is important in a lot of different functions, including emotions modulation of memory, attention, and perception. It's critical to sort of learn things in the environment that we find to be threats. It's important in some kinds of social evaluations, trusting other people. And we think of it sort of as a relevance detector, sort of telling me things that really are out in the environment that really matter. The other brain region I'm going to focus on today, pretty much, I'll talk about a few others later on, is the striatum. The striatum's here in green. The striatum's somewhat slightly above the amygdala. There's several subregions of the striatum. I'm mostly going to talk about the ventral striatum and the caudate, these two regions here. The striatum's been talked about a lot in studies of decision making. If you look at research on the striatum in another region, the orbitofrontal cortex, show that they code subjective value. So the more valuable you find something is, the more activity we see in the striatum. The less valuable you find it, the less activity. If I give you money, I'll see an increase in activity in the striatum. If I take money away from you, or if you lose money, I'll see a decrease. What's interesting about the striatum is it doesn't just respond to monetary rewards. They give in monkey studies, they give them juice all the time. People have done this in humans. Doesn't sound very attractive to me, getting a little tube with juice in my mouth, but nevertheless, when you're thirsty and you get juice, you see striatum activation. You see striatum responses in cocaine addicts when they're given cocaine. You see striatum activity in social cooperation, which people find rewarding, and also to beauty. So this seems to be kind of an indiscriminate reward circuitry. And it's important in learning the things that are rewarding. So this has a lot of details I'm not going to focus on here, but I put this up here to make a point about the relationship between the amygdala and striatum. This is a slide I borrowed from my collaborator and colleague, Joe Ledoux. Joe's been for years studying how rodents learn threats in the environment, things like tones that predict shock, and how they learn to avoid them. And in his studies, what he finds, here's the amygdala. So this is the amygdala here. It actually has a number of sort of subregions, which I'm not going to go into. But when there's a fear-arousing stimulus, the amygdala has one pathway that goes to the brainstem and creates all these autonomic responses I was talking about. it has another pathway that goes to the striatum. And if you were to damage this pathway, the rat would still learn to avoid the tone that means it's going to get a shock, because that requires, to make the decision to avoid the shock requires the link to the striatum. They wouldn't show the autonomic response, the rat, in that case. If you damage this pathway, the rat will still show autonomic nervous system arousal to a tone that means they're going to get a shock, but they would never learn to make the decision to leave the situation, right? So this circuitry here between the amygdala and striatum suggests that you take a cue from the amygdala that something threatening is out there, and by sending that signal to striatum, it gets incorporated into the value of the choices you can make, and it's important then in enabling that decision. And we think this similar circuitry, even though this is a certain situation of a rat trying to avoid something that means it's going to get a shock, that this sort of same circuitry plays out in much more subtle ways in human decision making. So we're going to look at that today. So I'm going to, this is the class participation part of the talk. So I have a question, 50-50. If you win, you get $10, but if you lose, you got to give me 12. Anybody taking me up on that? Anybody? Anybody? No? All right, how about this one? 50-50. If you win, you get $10, but if you lose, you give me $2.50. Anybody want that bet? Yeah, okay, not bad. How about this one, 50-50. If you win, you get $10. If I win, you give me $7.50. A few of you, a couple of you? Are you guys economists? Just curious. So these are risky decisions, right? Risky decisions, you don't really know what's going to happen. A lot of the decisions we make in our lives are risky, right? And there's a value to each of these decisions. So you were right to reject this one and to accept this one. If you did this one a lot, you'd make money, right? But many of you don't like to do that, right? Because there's still a cost. And this just highlights this notion. So when you make a risky decision, there are two factors that come into play. How sensitive are you to risk, right? So in general, like if it was between winning a little or winning a lot, would you take the choice to win a lot if it meant the probability is less than a little, then you'd be more risk-seeking, right? The other is loss aversion. So people tend to be more sensitive to losses relative to gains. People overvalue the loss, and this makes some sense in some circumstances. If losing something that's very critical to your survival, even if it's a little bit, you don't want to take the chance, right? In some circumstances, it makes no sense whatsoever to be loss averse. But people tend to be loss averse. They tend to weigh losses more than gains in making a decision. So even though, this means your chances of winning money is, the amount you'd win, would be more than the amount you'd lose, you'd still probably wouldn't take it because you wouldn't want to take the chance to lose the money. And that would be an indication of your aversion to losses. You weigh the potential loss more than you do the potential gain. All right, so we did a series of studies where we looked at these types of risky decisions, and based on the way that we modeled the behavior, and we did this work with an economist named Colin Kammerer, we could separately tell how loss averse somebody was versus how sensitive they were to risk. And they don't always go hand in hand. And so the two components of the risky decisions we measured were loss aversion and risk sensitivity. This is the way we did the task. The undergraduates, and I should say there's also some graduate students, would come into the lab, and they'd be given a whole series of choices like this. These amounts would vary, so this is what you could win, this is what you could lose, or you could get nothing. Do you place this bet or do you not place this bet? So there's your gamble, 50-50 probability. You're getting nothing is guaranteed. Do you accept this gamble? We do this about 140 times. They're paid actually some portion. We have to give them money in advance because we aren't allowed to have people leave the lab owing us money, right? So we give them $30 in advance, and then we pick a portion, and whatever they got, they got. If they lost the money, they have to pay us back. We measured a few things. One, we measured, again, the arousal response. This time I'm measuring skin conductance as our indication of an emotional response to the choice or the outcomes. And we also measured brain activity. So this is actually the MRI scanner that's in the psychology building at NYU. It's on the first floor. It makes these types of studies quite easy. well, relatively speaking. And what we measure is called the blood oxygenation level dependent signal. It's an indication of neural activity. It's kind of like the plumbing. The blood sort of follows the neural activity to bring in new nutrients. So it's kind of like we're measuring the plumbing of neural activity in the brain. It doesn't sound very nice, but it works well. And this is what we found. So just to show you the striatum, here the striatum predicted this, was correlated with the subjective value of the choice. So this includes risk sensitivity, it includes loss aversion, just how much, with all those individual factors that people brought to the table, how much did they value those individual choices? And not surprisingly, based on previous work, that correlated with striatum activity. We found a lot of variation in risk sensitivity and loss aversion. I'm going to focus on loss aversion, primarily because that's the only measure we saw was related to arousal. So this is just all of our individuals, participants, and you can see there's a lot of variability. So the lambda is the coefficient for loss aversion. If lambda equals 1, it means you weigh losses and gains equally. If it's greater than 1, you weigh losses more than gains. Less than 1, you weigh gains more than losses in making your decision. So you can see most of our participants were loss averse, but not all of them. When we looked to see what parts of the brain correlated with whether or not you were loss averse, we found the amygdala correlated with loss aversion. So the more loss averse you were, the more amygdala activation you showed when you lost money versus gained money. And interestingly, so did arousal. So this was a study done by Peter Sokol-Hessner in my lab when he was a graduate student. He calls this measure here sweat per buck. So it's how aroused were you when you received a loss versus a gain. And the more aroused you were when you lost money versus won money, the more loss averse you were. So this suggests risky decisions involve an assessment of value, but they're also influenced by these individual differences in sensitivity to risk and loss. We found arousal to losses correlates with loss aversion, but not risk sensitivity. So there was no relationship between your emotional response and riskiness, which was somewhat surprising. A lot of other studies have suggested arousal relates to how risky you are, but they've never actually separated the influence of loss aversion from risk per se. And we found amygdala activation correlates with loss aversion, but not risk sensitivity. And what we think is going on here is that perhaps emotion, it provides a signal of the threat of loss that is incorporated into the computation of subjective value. And again, we think this may be linked to the same circuitry that we see when a rodent's now trying to avoid something that predicts a threat of shock, that the amygdala seems to be coding for the threat of loss of money, and the striatum incorporates that signal into its computation of the subjective value of the decision. So we wanted to ask the question, and this was sort of when we were just starting to do some of this work, can an understanding of emotion and brain function inform other aspects of economic decision making? And so here we went to an economist at NYU named Andrew Schotter, and we started to just talk about problems in economics that maybe some understanding brain function could actually help understand a little bit better. And we came up with this notion of auctions. So auctions are interesting. Anybody ever been on eBay? Anybody? A couple of you, yeah? Did you buy anything good? Yeah? So, economists know very well that, one of the benefits of auctions is that people pay too much. People have a tendency to overbid in auctions. Now, any of you have ever been on eBay, when it's winding down, right, and you sit there and you're like, oh, no, someone outbid me, wait. There's actually programs that let you keep outbidding people, which is kind of silly. But obviously, as you know, on eBay, you can get all sorts of things, like tickets to sports games, nice apparel. What's interesting about auctions is people pay too much. Economists know this. So if you go on eBay, this is actually an eBay screenshot. There are things called eBay gift cards, right? I'm just pointing out one of these. This is a $50 eBay gift card. There are 10 bids, and the high bid now is $51, right? I mean, seriously, you go home and do this, you'll see this. It's crazy, right? So people pay too much in auctions, and the question is, why do they pay too much in auctions? Well, the leading theory from economics at the time was that auctions lead to overbidding, and that this is due to the added emotion of the joy of winning. So when you win an auction, think about it. You don't only get the value of the thing that you were bidding on. you also get the value of beating these other people. That's enjoyable, right? I don't know if you ever felt that way. I kind of felt like that when I was on eBay. And so this is the primary theory from economics. And we were thinking, well, the striatum, as I already mentioned to you, is a region that responds to all types of value, including social value. So maybe what we should see is, when you're in an auction, you should actually get more striatal signal to the gain, because the striatal signal is larger for larger gains, and it decreases more for bigger losses. So we did an experiment with Andy, and here's a picture of Andy. We had two conditions. You played an auction for money or points, and it wasn't so different whether you played for money or points, so I'm going to group across those two. Or you played a lottery game where the computer kind of gave you something. You were sort of, you basically had to bid, and a computer randomly assigned a number, and if it beat you, it beat you. And so they were identical other than whether you were playing against a person or playing against a computer. So what do we see? Well, in the brain, this is what we saw. So here, this is from the lottery game. So again, this is the striatal response to when you win versus lose money, right? And we pulled out that response, and then we said, how's it different in the two situations? Here's a lottery game. When you win money, you see an increase in striatal activation, as you should. We've seen that many times. You win money, you get an increase. When you lose money, nothing happens, which makes sense. I'm sorry. You don't lose money. That's the point, right? You lose the game. Right? So you played against, you didn't lose anything, you just didn't win. Right? So you didn't win the lottery, and you see nothing. In the auction games, what we were expecting, if it was the joy of winning, was actually it was going to be a boost up here, right? But that's not what we saw. So when you win the auction, you see an increase, which is fine because you win something, you win money. They were betting on money amounts. When you lose, you see a big loss signal. Right? But you didn't actually lose anything, you just didn't win, right? It looks like you lost, though. Your brain looks like you lost. And so what this was telling us was that perhaps, and then when we looked to see, well, which signal predicted what you chose, the bid that you made, and only this signal predicted the bid that you made, not your response to the gains. So only the loss signal predicted the bid that you made, not the response to the win. So this suggested to us that social competition, so what you did lose in the auction was the social competition, right? You didn't lose any money, you lost a social competition. And that social competition leads to a greater striatal response to losing in an auction, and that's correlated with overbidding, how much you paid. So this led to us saying, does loss aversion actually lead to overbidding in auctions? So we did. Now I should point out, this is a correlational technique. I can't really say that from this, and it's a brain signal. It's not loss aversion, right? It's a brain signal. So we did a second study with Andy, and we asked, can we increase bidding by emphasizing the loss? So there were three conditions. It was the same auction game. People came into the laboratory and they just played the auction game. Another group came into the laboratory and they said, well, and if you win, you don't just get the value of the thing that you bid, you get an extra $15. And the other group came in and we said, if you lose we said, we're going to give you $15 to start to just at the beginning, but if you don't win the auction, we're going to take away your $15, right? And we found that, if we emphasized the loss, it led to greater overbidding. People bid more in this condition where we basically said, you lose your $15 gift, as opposed you get a bonus. Right? And led to a higher profit for a hypothetical auctioneer. And we also saw correlation in that case with amygdala activation in the other study. So this suggested to us that, that overbidding in auctions may be due to fear of losing, loss aversion, rather than the joy of winning. So what I've suggested to you so far is that arousal to losses correlates with loss aversion, but not risk sensitivity. Loss aversion may also be linked to the tendency to overbid in auctions. But now, all of these things I've showed you, right, except for that last experimental manipulation in the laboratory, was that there's this correlation between loss aversion and choices, and also between arousal. But now I want to ask the question, so if I change arousal, if I can change your emotional response, can I change your loss aversion? And we have two techniques that we use to do this. The first is to give you a drug that influences arousal. And the second is to ask you to use a strategy that can change emotions that's often used in clinical practice. So first, to give you a drug, what drug do we use? We use a drug called propranolol. Propranolol is a beta-adrenergic receptor antagonist, so-called beta blocker. It's not used, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, so we know it gets to regions in the brain linked to arousal responses, and we know particularly it gets to the amygdala. It blunts arousal responses without a sedative effect. It used to be given more frequently for things like high blood pressure. Now it's given for things like stage fright or fear of flying, right? Situations where in stage fright, I've never tried it myself, but someone who took it told me basically it took away the sort of nervousness of her body, and that made her actually have an easier time giving the presentation. It's been shown to reduce the effect of emotion on memory. So as I mentioned, and this we know is due to by influencing the beta-adrenergic receptors in the amygdala. So the amygdala doesn't modulate the storage of memory in the hippocampus. And so it has its effect centrally in the amygdala. In rats, you can inject the amygdala itself and show that that drug will change the amygdala response to arousing events and influence its effect on cognition. So we gave people propranolol or not, and I should say it's a very mild drug. People don't know if they've taken it, and it's actually a quite safe drug. Nevertheless, we do a full medical history and EKG, and if there's any problem whatsoever, even if they just have a low heart rate, we have to take them out of our study. They do the same series of choices I already told you about. They do them twice. On the first day, they're either given the drug or the placebo. We have them eat something because it sort of helps with the propranolol getting into their bloodstream. And we wait a while for the drug to take effect. We do the same choices. We measure loss aversion and risk sensitivity. And what we found, and one thing I should say about propranolol, is something called lipophilic. So the more body fat you have, the less effective it's going to be. And so what we found is that in our low BMI participants, we found that propranolol selectively reduced loss aversion, not in our high BMI participants. And we think this is because the drug was less effective in them. So propranolol reduces loss aversion just for the low BMI participants, suggesting it's sort of dose dependent. You have to have a certain amount of propranolol on board to reduce arousal. It reduced arousal for everybody, but to reduce loss aversion. There was no change, again, in how sensitive people were to risk. And this provides evidence that arousal and or its neural mediators is selectively and causally linked to this tendency to avoid losses. But of course, let's just say for some reason you want to reduce your loss aversion. You would not necessarily want to take a drug to do that. Another technique we can use, and this is the technique we use a lot in studies of how do we control emotion, is simply using your thoughts to change your emotion. I think it's an underappreciated aspect of emotion that, we think of emotions as reactions that we experience, right? But a lot of our emotional responses have to do with how we approach the situation. In the US, we have a phrase that's the glass is half full or half empty. And this just is used to characterize people that kind of see the positive in a situation or see the negative in a situation. Individuals vary in how they do that, but we can also teach people how to do that, and this is what they do in cognitive therapy. So in cognitive therapy, if you were to go to a therapist for something like depression, they would talk to you about the relationship between your mental state, how you approach it, your cognitions, and your feelings. And they would show you a little cartoon like this. So here's this nice dog. This particular kitty sees this dog as a friendly playmate. This particular kitty sees the same dog as a threat. And it just highlights the notion of how you can change what you think about and feel differently about it. So what we did, again, we're using the same task that I already described to you. We brought people into the laboratory, and we gave them one whole set of choices. And we said for these choices, this is the only choice you're going to make. You're going to make the choice in isolation. Just focus on this choice for each individual choice. For the other half of the choices, and these were intermixed, the two strategies. We said, I want you now to think like you're a trader on Wall Street, and you're really assembling a portfolio of choices. This is really one of many choices that you're going to make. And again, we assessed for each of these loss aversion and risk sensitivity. So again, these are the same individuals you saw previously, right? These are the loss averse individuals, the gain loss neutral individuals, the gain seeking individuals. And this is the change in lambda with the strategy. So you can see some of the highly loss averse individuals became less loss averse. Some of the gain seeking individuals became more gain seeking. But this strategy of thinking of a portfolio tended to reduce their response to losses overall. So it decreased loss aversion. And it also reduced the physiological arousal response to losses as well. When we were looking at the brain, so this is actually the circuitry that's been identified for using a cognitive regulation strategy to diminish your response to threat. This thing predicts you might get a shock, so I want you to now think about it differently to reduce your arousal to the shock. And what we see is the amygdala we know is involved in the expression of that type of simple fear learning. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a region that we know is involved in what we call executive function, cognitive control. So you need it when you sort of manipulate your internal thoughts consciously. So we think in this case, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in emotion regulation plays a role in the active reinterpretation of the meaning of the event that you're regulating. And this region doesn't have a lot of direct connectivity to the amygdala itself, but it does connect to other regions of the brain, the more ventral medial prefrontal cortex regions that project directly to the amygdala. So we think this region's having its influence through engaging this sort of circuitry. We also see a similar circuitry when I say now you're expecting an reward, and I want to now diminish your excitement about that reward. But here we see diminished responses in the striatum. So when we looked in the brain, when we compared which regions show me more activity when you're just attending to each individual choice versus now thinking like a trader, we see the amygdala comes out. And here is the difference in the brain response. And here's the reduction in loss aversion from attend to regulate. So the amygdala response is diminished as you reduce your loss aversion across individuals. So those who use the strategy more effectively showed a greater reduction in amygdala activity. And it wasn't influenced, it wasn't related to your response to gain. So we think here the effect is simply to reduce your arousal response and your amygdala response to losses per se. And we also see, consistent with this emotion regulation circuitry, this region, which we think is important in enacting that strategy sort of consciously, trial to trial. This region, which we think is important in inhibiting the amygdala. And once again, the striatum correlated with subjective value, which varied across the two conditions, but the striatum consistently correlated with subjective value. So this suggests that when you're changing loss aversion, you're using this standard brain circuitry that you would use to regulate your emotions across a number of different circumstances. So in this section, I suggested to you that techniques that alter emotion through drugs and cognitive emotion regulation change loss aversion. So pharmacologically reducing arousal reduces loss aversion. Cognitive emotion regulation techniques that reduce arousal, loss aversion, and arousal responses, and arousal to the losses. Reappraising choices engages a typical emotion regulation circuitry, and we find no effect of regulation or drug on risk sensitivity. So I just want to sum up quickly. So I've suggested to you today that in spite of the sort of intuitive and historical nature of these dual systems of deciding with your heart and your head, these theories of emotion and reason, there's no evidence for dual systems in the brain. Both emotion and decision-making involve a lot of different processes. I've only talked about some of them here, some of the factors that we call emotion, some of the factors that we know are linked to making choices, and that they have complex interactions. So I've talked about arousal, how it's linked to temporal discounting, how it's linked to loss aversion, how we find no relationship with risk sensitivity, and how it may play a role in overbidding in auctions. And just for the bigger summaries, I just want to highlight that I think, it's not that we can't differentiate factors that we link to emotion and we link to decision, but really emotion modulates the computation of value by providing signals about the emotional significance of events and therefore changes your decisions. If we can characterize the relation between affective factors and decision variables, we can inform our understanding of choice behavior and also suggest sort of novel approaches for altering the decisions. I want to thank NYUAD for having me here today. The economists and neuroscientists who worked with me were Colin Kammerer, who's at Caltech, Paul Glemscher, and Andrew Schotter at NYU. And the students who worked on the projects you saw were Peter Sokol-Hessner, Candice Rao, Carolina Lempert, and Mauricia Delgado. And I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
It's such a huge subject, and really, I don't know how I can put this, but thinking about the emotional intelligence, two aspects of the human.
Yep.
Have you heard of, I think it's Professor Grossman,
Yep.
who's formulated the formula for intelligence?
You're talking about emotional intelligence?
Well, no, not particularly emotional intelligence. He has a formula now for intelligence. There
Okay.
is such a, he's done years of study or something. But I just wondered, because he's done parallel study, well, his study is through computer intelligence, and can you recreate the stuff of brains and humans in the virtual world and so on, as where we're heading, you know.
Divergent.
Yeah. And so what I'm asking you is, did you do a control to what your studies have been, or any controls, or have you thought of trying to sort of put this into the computer to science to compare the reactions? Because now...
So you're saying, have we built a computational model,
Yes.
a sort of not just a computational model, but a model, have we tried to build a system on the computer that takes advantage of emotion?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we haven't.
Have you thought to go ahead that way?
Well, so what we're trying to do, which is a little, which is one step there. I mean, I think our understanding at this point is so cursory. It'd be really hard to know how to do that. But we're working a lot. So one of the advantages of psychologists like me or neuroscientists working with economists, they use these mathematical models to model, and that's actually one of the reasons we've worked with them. So Andy Schotter, our work with him on the auctions can show you exactly what the change in the curve is. So that is the kind of, when you have loss. So that is the kind of thing you could put into a program that bids. So it's people bid extra whether or not they are threatened with some type of loss, but they bid more when you say you're going to lose money, right? And we quantify that, and we could enter that in a program that would mimic that, if that's what you're asking about. It's a little bit difficult. Now, one of the things we're doing now is looking at sort of reinforcement learning models. How do you learn? How do you update the value of things? And what we're finding is that these arousal responses are correlated with sort of a change in the learning rate, right? So you can update the value. Let's say you have a cue and you get $1. Maybe the first time you don't think that means $1. Maybe that you're like, okay, that's better than average, but it's probably not always $1. The next time you get $1 again, okay, now I really believe it's $1. Like how quickly you learn that is the learning rate. And what we're finding is that arousal actually is linked to your learning rate. So when something's very surprising, you're more likely to learn about it quickly. And so that's another function. So these are the types of things we can quantify on a trial-by-trial basis that we could put into a computer model. But I think we're still really, in the infancy of doing this. So I don't, the question is, again, it depends on what you want the computer to do. Do you want to mimic humans? Do you want it to make a certain type of choice? That may or may not, that humans may be bad at sometimes or not be bad at sometimes. And this, of course, is happening in the stock market. And I didn't mention, arousal. There's a guy named Andrew Lowe who's done all this research looking at traders in the stock market measuring arousal. And he argues that novice traders show more fluctuation in their arousal responses in volatile markets than seasoned traders. And then he finds that they also make more choices that are consistent with loss aversion, right? Like doubling down. They don't, whatever it is, they don't want to lose, right? Even when sometimes, the smart thing to do is take a loss and move on, right? whereas seasoned traders don't. Now, that was a little bit the motivation for our portfolio manipulation, this notion of when you can see the big picture, you may make a different decision, right? And I think it depends whether you want it in a computer model like that, depends on what you want, what the outcome you want is, right? I mean, I think these emotions are adaptive sometimes and sometimes not, right? It just depends.
In terms of risk aversion,
Yeah.
is that something that is genetic, or is it more environmental and based on the kind of situations that you found yourself in as you?
So there have been people, and I don't know the answer, is my answer, but there are economists starting to look at genetics. You know, we've done some studies on genetics and temporal discounting and saw some genetic variables that were linked to temporal discounting. So, you know, the notion that these are tendencies, individuals that you know, by which individuals vary, you know, that variability has to come from one of two places, right? It comes from your experience or it comes from your genetics, right? So the notion that, you know, some of these tendencies are linked to genetics, I think, is a very reasonable notion. Studies of behavioral genetics right now are very challenging. You know, there were a lot of sort of early studies that were done linking genetics with things like depression, and a lot of them haven't held up over time. And so the standards in genetics for saying that a behavior is linked to some genetic variation have become quite rigorous for good reason, just because many things didn't hold up. So, but I would certainly expect that some of these, you know, individual variations we see would have at least, you know, some link to genetics.
Thanks.
Are there other regions in the brain that are linked to what we think of as emotion?
Yeah, you know, I gave a very small, short presentation just focusing on two regions for a more general audience. The other region that comes up often in studies of emotion decision making is the insular cortex. The insular cortex is a region that we often see linked to physiological arousal. It's been shown that there was a recent meta-analysis that showed looked at the correlation of brain regions with subjective value. So just across all these different brain imaging studies, what regions correlate with subjective value. And the striatum correlate with subjective value, a region of the orbital frontal cortex correlate with subjective value. That region's also been implicated in emotion, but probably different subregions. The insular cortex showed this sort of U-shape. So if it's really high or low, you get insular cortex activity. And they suggest that's because, you know, this is a region that shows a lot of activity when you get a lot of arousal. And that, you know, when it's a high or low arousal, if it's really, you know, arousal can be due to really something's really negative or something's really positive, right? You just get aroused by both. And maybe the insula is sort of feeding in some ways, that signal to the computation of subjective value. The amygdala we're seeing more in regions, in studies where, like loss in particular, right? Not as much in sort of these high reward circumstances. So I think it's going to be quite variable. And as I said, the orbital frontal cortex is a region that correlates with subjective value, but other regions are linked to emotional responses. So, you know, within the orbital frontal cortex, it's kind of a big area. So I'm giving you kind of the cartoon version of a sort of a beginning science on this, and in part because, you know, I can't talk about everything, but also in part because it is a beginning baby science, you know, and even just understanding this one little circuitry, I think, is a start.
Are diseases or mental disorders like Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia, do they affect how you are risk sensitive or loss averse?
So we haven't studied that, but I suspect they would. One disease where we see a lot of influence on decision making is Parkinson's disease. What's interesting about Parkinson's disease is that it involves the striatum. The striatum's involved in a lot of motor actions, as well as processing reward. And in Parkinson's disease, you get a decrease in dopamine in the striatum, which leads to some of the symptoms. But dopamine is also a neurotransmitter that tells you like what's rewarding, right? So when they want to treat Parkinson's disease, they sometimes give drugs that increase dopamine, and sometimes it leads to patients developing gambling addictions. You know, and so they have to really find a balance, right? Because now these people are and they're less sensitive to loss, right? They get more excited about the rewards and they become less sensitive to the losses. And so that kind of leads to keep trying to get the reward without the loss. And so, you know, so they have to watch for that when they start to treat Parkinson's disease because it is one consequence.